There are places whose histories cannot be told quickly. Places that begin as acts of faith become institutions of control and end as mirrors of the societies that built them. The Bedlam Asylum was one such place. Over centuries, it changed its purpose, its name, and its methods, from medieval priory to public spectacle, from supposed care to cruelty, and finally, to reform. Tonight we follow that long history in full, not in fragments, not in outrage, but slowly, as it unfolded. This is the quiet history of the Bedlam Asylum, from its beginnings to its reckoning. Before Bedlam became a word whispered with unease, before it meant chaos, madness, or loss of reason, before it became synonymous with screaming and chains, it was something altogether quieter. A name, a place, a prayer. The word itself, Bedlam, would not come to mean disorder for centuries yet. In 1247, when this story begins, it was simply Bethlehem, the holy city, the place of Christ's birth, a name chosen not for England, but for somewhere impossibly distant, across seas, through deserts, to a land most Londoners would never see, but could only imagine through the filtered light of stained glass windows and the voices of returning crusaders. And yet, here, in the damp and crowded streets just beyond London's ancient walls, that distant name was about to take root. If we step back, far back, into medieval London, to the middle of the 13th century, we find no asylum as we would recognize one today. No wards with locked doors, no diagnoses written in careful script. No doctors pacing stone corridors with keys jangling at their belts and theories of humours on their lips. Instead, we find a small religious house. The year is 1247. The reign is Henry III. The world is still mapped in prayers and pilgrimage routes. An Italian bishop named Goffredo de Prefetti, bishop-elect of Bethlehem, a title more symbolic than practical, since his bishopric had been occasioned by misfortune. Financial troubles had befallen his see, troubles he hoped to remedy by generating income across Europe. Arrives in London with a purpose. He needs funds, he needs patrons, he needs land. And he finds all three in a man named Simon Fitzmary. Simon Fitzmary. Remember that name? Simon had risen from modest origins to become Sheriff of London, twice. A controversial figure among his peers, a man who led opposition to the mayor and looked to the crown for support, earning him the enmity of his fellow aldermen. But he was also a man marked by belief. Legend tells us that, during his time in the Crusades, he developed a veneration for the Virgin Mary and the Star of Bethlehem. Perhaps he saw terrible things in those distant wars. Perhaps he made promises to God in moments when death came close. Perhaps he simply believed with the intensity that only those who have witnessed horror can believe. That salvation is real, that prayer has weight, that names have power. Whatever moved him, in October 1247, shortly after stepping down as sheriff, Simon gave property on the outskirts of London to the Order of St. Mary of Bethlehem for the purpose of establishing a new priory. The location, just beyond London's Wall, in the parish of St. Botolph without Bishopsgate. A patch of ground that would one day be covered by Liverpool Street Station, but which then was simply field and air and possibility. The gift was exceptional. There is no evidence that the Order of Bethlehem held any property in England prior to 1245. Simon may have been the first man to give them land. And so it began. The priory of the new Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem. Not a hospital, Not yet. Its purpose was devotional and financial. The priory collected alms, donations from Londoners, to support the Crusader Church and to link England spiritually to Bethlehem. Coins passed from hand to hand. Prayers were offered. Candles were lit for wars being fought in places most donors could not imagine. The priory housed the poor and provided hospitality to visiting bishops, canons, and brothers of Bethlehem when they passed through. It was compact, covering just 2 acres, centered around a courtyard with a chapel in the middle, with approximately 12 cells for residents, a kitchen, staff accommodation, and an exercise yard. Members of the priory wore a star upon their cloaks and capes, the Star of Bethlehem, to symbolize their obedience to the church in the Holy Land. Imagine them, small figures in the London fog, marked by their celestial symbol, moving between the city and their quiet enclosure. For many years, that was all it was. A place of prayer, a place of collection, a place whose name evoked somewhere holy and unreachably far away. The building stood quietly, doing what medieval religious institutions often did best, existing as part of the city's background hum, the rhythm of bells, the murmur of Latin, the clink of coins in collection boxes, the slow accumulation of years. And for a time, decades perhaps, nothing changed. But history has a way of changing a place long before its name changes. Medieval society had no clear language for mental illness, as we understand it today. There were no neat categories, no psychology, no treatment plans, no understanding of neurons, chemicals, trauma, or disease processes that affect the mind. Instead, madness was explained through belief. Mental illness was frequently attributed to demonic possession, witchcraft, or divine punishment. The belief was that affected individuals were either possessed by demons or under divine punishment, with treatment methods varying widely, including prayer, exorcism, or confinement. But the reality was more complex than this implies. Medieval authors didn't only use the term possession, they also used the term obsession, meaning to be tortured or tormented or harmed in some way without the demon taking over the person's being entirely. Some clergy showed compassion. One Bavarian priest in the 1370s suggested that those who took their own lives while experiencing demonic harassment deserved to be buried with their loved ones, even though that was usually forbidden, a remarkably humane view for the time. Medieval physicians often rejected demonic explanations for melancholy and focused instead on humoral causes, imbalances of the 4 bodily fluids believed to govern health and temperament. Demons appeared regularly as causes of mental disorder in saints' lives and miracle stories, but they were far from the only explanation. Early medieval sources attributed mental disorder to epilepsy, demons, drunkenness, and simply madness. The truth is, people didn't know. They used the language they had. They drew on the beliefs available to them. They reached for explanations that made sense within their understanding of how the world worked. A world where demons and humors were equally real, where God's punishment and bodily illness could coexist, where the line between the spiritual and the physical was not clearly drawn. Those afflicted were called mente capti, taken in the mind, seized, captured by something beyond themselves, and gradually, quietly, without ceremony, people like this began to appear at the priory. The first unmistakable record comes from the year 1403. A visitation document, a routine inspection by authorities checking on religious houses, notes something unexpected. 6 men housed at Bethlem, described plainly, without drama, as sex viri mente capti. 6 men insane. Instruments of restraint for use with them had definitely been there since at least 1398. Just 6. A small number, easily overlooked in the margins of history. But the shift had begun. When did it start? We don't know precisely. It likely happened organically, rather than as a result of any specific decision. Perhaps a family brought someone they could no longer care for. Perhaps a parish priest sent someone who disrupted services. Perhaps the priory simply had space and compassion, or at least a willingness to contain what others could not. In 1377, King Richard II closed down Stone House, a small hospital in Charing Cross, which had, until that point, been picking up the majority of the most needy and problematic among London's mad. Residents from Stone House were transferred to Bethlem, and this event is generally considered to mark the start of its evolution from priory hospital to dedicated lunatic asylum. The priory, once devoted to prayer and fundraising for a distant Holy Land, was slowly becoming something else, a place where those who did not fit, who frightened their families, disrupted parishes, or could not be managed at home, were sent away, not for healing, not for understanding, but for containment. During the 13th and 14th centuries, with its activities underwritten by episcopal and papal indulgences, the hospital's role as a centre for alms collection persisted, but its linkage to the Order of Bethlehem increasingly unravelled, putting its purpose and patronage in doubt. In 1346, the Master of Bethlem applied to the city authorities seeking protection. Thereafter, metropolitan office holders claimed power to oversee the appointment of masters and demanded in return an annual payment of 40 shillings. By October 1346, the Mayor of London and his aldermen agreed to take the hospital under their protection, and many of those involved also made provision for the building in their wills, securing its longer-term future. In 1370, Edward III gained ownership over the hospital, creating the first secular ownership. The religious institution was becoming civic. The spiritual mission was becoming practical. The distant connection to Bethlehem was fading like an old map losing its ink. By 1460, Bethlem was officially a specialist institution for the confinement of the insane. The transformation was complete. Over time, the name itself began to change. Bethlehem softened into Bethlem. Londoners clipped it further, twisted it in daily speech, and later still, distorted by centuries of tongues, into a word that would come to mean disorder itself. Bedlam. By the 17th century, the word Bedlam had entered everyday speech to signify madness, chaos, and the irrational nature of the world. When someone said, "It's Bedlam in there," they weren't referring to a hospital. They were describing confusion, noise, things falling apart. The name of a holy place had become the name of hell. But in these early centuries, that word had not yet hardened. It had not yet become cruel. It was simply a place, a religious house turned refuge, a refuge turning slowly into confinement, a quiet beginning to a very loud history. And here, it is important to pause. Because medieval madness was not yet a spectacle. It was not entertainment. It was not even fully feared in the way it would later become. It was, more often, endured. a condition to be tolerated, hidden, prayed over, or locked away when necessary. The walls of Bethlem, as it came to be known, did not yet echo with the screams that would define it. They did not yet ring with the laughter of tourists or the rattle of chains for public display. They echoed with uncertainty, with misunderstanding, with the uneasy silence of a society that did not know what to do with minds that wandered beyond its rules. 6 men in 1403. 6 minds taken. 6 stories we will never fully know. But they were the beginning. As the city grew around it, louder, wealthier, more curious, Bedlam would soon become something London could no longer ignore. The quiet containment would become loud display. The refuge would become a prison. The mystery would become a spectacle. But that comes later. For now, let us linger in this earlier world, where madness was still mysterious, where fear had not yet learned how to profit from suffering, and where Bedlam had not yet learned what it would become. Rest here for a moment. The stone walls are still calm. The priory bell rings for vespers. 6 men sit in their cells, taken in their minds, while the city sleeps uneasily beyond the walls, and history is only just beginning to stir. Picture London in the year 1674. 8 years have passed since the Great Fire tore through the city, consuming 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and the livelihoods of tens of thousands. The flames had stopped at the city walls, just short of where Bethlem stood in Bishopsgate, sparing the old hospital, but not sparing the city its trauma. Now, in the aftermath, London is rebuilding itself with unprecedented ambition. Christopher Wren's spires are beginning to rise from the ashes. The monument, a towering column of Portland stone commemorating the fire and the city's resurrection, is under construction. There is money flowing through the city again, and with it, a desire to prove something, that London can be greater than it was before, more elegant, more orderly, more magnificent. And it is in this moment of civic renewal that the governors of Bethlem Hospital make a decision. The old building in Bishopsgate is crumbling. The walls are weak. The structure is unsound. It has housed the insane for nearly 3 centuries, but it can barely house them any longer. In 1674, the Court of Governors declares the hospital to be very old, weak and ruinous, and too small and strait for keeping the greater number of lunatics therein at poor scent. They need a new building, but not just any building. Something that will announce to London and to the world that this hospital matters, that charity matters, that the governors themselves matter. What they decide to build will become one of the most famous and most infamous structures in England. The man they choose is Robert Hooke. Hooke, remember that name. He is already a figure of considerable reputation. Professor of Geometry at Gresham College, curator of experiments to the Royal Society, collaborator with Christopher Wren on some of London's most important post-fire reconstruction projects, including the monument itself. Hooke is brilliant, difficult, ambitious, and meticulous. He understands both science and spectacle. He knows how to make a building speak. And the governors want this building to speak very loudly indeed. Construction begins in April 1675. By August 1676, just 16 months later, King Charles II himself visits to inspect the nearly completed structure. It is fast, it is expensive, and it is enormous. When Londoners first see the new Bethlem Hospital rising at Moorfields, they are astonished. The building stretches over 500 feet across the landscape, longer than many palaces. Its facade is baroque, symmetrical, imposing. There are cube-shaped pavilions crowned with pyramidal roofs and cupolas. The surrounding walls extend for 680 feet. The south face at the rear runs for 714 feet. Inside, Hooke has designed something unprecedented: the gallery ward. Long, capacious corridors, 13 feet high and 16 feet wide, run the entire length of both floors, stretching a combined 1,179 feet. These galleries are so vast that one contemporary observer, Roger Lestrange, writes that their vast length wearies the travelling eyes of strangers. On one side of these galleries, rows of cells, each with a small barred window facing south. No glass, just iron bars and open air. On the other side, the galleries themselves, glazed with windows facing north, flooded with light. The design is innovative. Hooke has adopted a single-pile method of construction. Cells on one side, corridor on the other, to ensure ventilation, fresh air, light, space. But let us be clear about what this design is really for. The architectural historian who has studied Hooke's plans most closely notes that these galleries were constructed more for public display than for the care of patients. Initially, inmates are prohibited from using the galleries, ostensibly so that visitors won't be endangered. But the real purpose is obvious. The galleries are stages, promenades, spaces where the public can walk freely and observe the patients through the bars of their cells. The new hospital can accommodate 120 patients, double the capacity of the old building. But the governors are not thinking primarily about patients. They are thinking about donors. Contemporary poems celebrating the new Bethlem Hospital describe it as so brave, so neat, so sweet it does appear, makes one half mad to be a lodger there. Comparisons are made to the Palace of Versailles. One pamphlet from 1676 is titled Bethlehem's Beauty, London's Charity, and the City's Glory, a panegyrical poem on that magnificent structure lately erected in Moorfields, vulgarly called New Bedlam. The building is meant to inspire awe, to attract visitors, to awaken pity, and open purses. The policy of opening the doors to visitors is already well established at the old Bishopsgate site. But now, at Moorfields, with this grand new structure, the practice will reach its infamous peak. Bethlem is about to become one of the most visited sites in London. But before we enter, we must first look up. Above the gates of the new hospital, reclining on plinths to either side of the entrance portico, are two massive stone figures, life-sized. No, larger than life-sized. Carved from Portland stone by the Danish sculptor Caius Gabriel Cibber in 1676. These figures will guard the gates of Bethlem for the next 139 years, becoming landmarks in their own right, as recognizable to Londoners as the hospital itself. Their names, Raving Madness and Melancholy Madness. Raving Madness. His body is twisted, contorted in agony. His face is pulled upward in a grotesque grimace of fury and desperation. His arms are pinned, restrained by heavy chains that wrap around his torso and bind his wrists. He writhes against them, caught in a permanent frozen struggle. This is what the 17th century understood as raving madness. What we might today call psychosis, a mind consumed by furies it cannot control. Melancholy summer madness. His body is flaccid, slack, lifeless. His face wears a haunted, vacant expression, not rage, but absence. He is unbound, unchained, yet he cannot move. He stares into nothing. He has withdrawn so far inward that the world outside no longer reaches him. This is melancholy madness, what we might today call severe depression, a mind that has collapsed into itself. These two categories, raving and melancholy, were how mental illness was understood in Cibber's time. You were either consumed by excess emotion, or you were consumed by its absence, either too much feeling or none at all. The statues are instructive. They are meant to teach. They tell visitors, this is what you will see inside. These are the two faces of madness. Be warned, be awed, and be grateful you are not one of them. They also tell visitors, donate generously, because these figures, for all their grotesquerie, are advertisements. The poor boxes are placed nearby. The message is clear. Pity these wretches and give. But there is something else these statues do. They dehumanize. They turn madness into caricature, into spectacle, into something monstrous and other, something to be stared at from a safe distance, something that belongs on the outside of the gates, rather than walking freely among the sane. By the time you walk past raving and melancholy madness and enter the hospital, you have already been taught how to see the people inside, not as patients, not as suffering individuals, but as curiosities. And London is very, very curious. From the moment the new Moorfields Hospital opens, visitors pour in. Who comes? Everyone. Aristocrats and merchants, tourists from abroad, families on outings, groups of friends seeking amusement, servants with time off, country visitors seeing London for the first time. Bethlem becomes part of the London tourist trail, ranked alongside the Tower of London, the Royal Menagerie, London's Zoo, Westminster Abbey, and London Bridge as one of the essential sights to see. Guidebooks mention it, poets write about it, travellers from France, Germany, Italy, and the Americas record their visits in letters and diaries. Until 1770, the hospital is open to the public 6 days a week at specified times. Access is unrestricted. You simply walk in. You are encouraged to drop a donation into the poor boxes near the entrance. But there is no official entrance fee. Some visitors give a penny, some give more, some give nothing. The exact number of visitors is impossible to know for certain, but estimates based on the hospital's poor box receipts suggest tens of thousands annually. One widely cited, though disputed, figure puts it at 96,000 visitors per year during the peak decades of the 18th century. Even if that number is inflated, the reality is clear. Visiting Bethlem is popular, extremely popular. So what do visitors see when they enter? They walk along the great galleries, those long, bright, echoing corridors that run the full length of the building. On one side, barred windows looking out onto the gardens. On the other side, the cells. The cells are small. Each patient has one with a tiny window, unglazed, just bars, facing south for light and air. Inside, a bed, perhaps a chair, little else. Some patients are quiet. They sit, they stare. They do not respond when spoken to. Others are not quiet. A contemporary account from the late 17th century describes swarms of people descending on Bethlem during public holidays, filling the galleries with noise and laughter. Visitors move from cell to cell, peering in, commenting, calling out to the inmates. An 18th century observer records seeing 100 people at least, running, rioting up and down the wards, making sport and diversion of the miserable inhabitants. Some patients, the observer notes, were provoked by the insults of this holiday mob into furies of rage. Visitors poke patients with sticks. They throw objects into the cells. They shout to provoke reactions. They offer alcohol to see what will happen. They laugh. Attendants, known as warders or keepers, sometimes encourage this behavior, hoping for tips from amused visitors. Ned Ward, writing in his satirical periodical The London Spy in 1699, describes a visit to Bethlem where the sociable nature of the outing includes not only cheap entertainment, but more sordid activities implied in his bawdy prose. This is not healthcare. This is a freak show. And yet, not everyone sees it this way. Some visitors genuinely believe they are engaging in a form of moral instruction. One mid-18th century commentator writes, "There is no better lesson to be taught us in any part of the globe than in this school of misery." The idea is this: by witnessing madness, by seeing what happens when reason is overthrown by passion, when vice leads to ruin, when the mind collapses, the visitor learns to be virtuous, to be moderate, to fear excess. Madness, in this view, is a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when you lose control. And so visiting Bethlem becomes, for some, an act of self-improvement, a reminder to stay sane. But let us not be naive. For the vast majority of visitors, the primary allure is not moral edification. It is, in the words of historian Roy Porter, the frisson of the freak show. It is entertainment. It is novelty. It is the thrill of seeing something transgressive, something disturbing, something you are not supposed to see, but are allowed to see. It is voyeurism dressed up as charity. Part of the draw is the celebrity patients. Bethlem houses some notable figures, whose presence adds to the spectacle. Nathaniel Lee, the famous Restoration playwright, is confined here in the 1680s after a mental breakdown. Visitors come specifically to see him. Lee reportedly says, upon his release, "They called me mad, and I called them mad, and damn them, they outvoted me." Daniel, Oliver Cromwell's former porter, becomes a curiosity for those who remember the Commonwealth era. Various remarkable characters whose stories circulate in London society, drawing the curious and the cruel alike. The hospital becomes a place where you might glimpse the wreckage of fame, where you can see what happens when greatness collapses, where madness becomes a public spectacle precisely because it has claimed someone recognizable. Why do the governors allow this? Because they need the money. Bethlem is a charity hospital. It receives some funding from the City of London, but it is nowhere near enough. Patient fees cover only a small portion of operating costs. The rest must come from donations, and the donations flow most freely when the public is engaged, when they can see what their money supports, when they feel connected to the hospital's mission, even if that connection is deeply problematic. From the 1720s until 1770, Bethlem collects on average between £300 and £350 annually from the poor boxes. That is significant revenue. It pays for food, for staff, for repairs, for the daily operation of the hospital. After 1770, when public access is restricted, those poor box donations plummet to about £20 or £30 per year. The governors are not blind to this reality. They have built a magnificent structure specifically designed to attract visitors, specifically designed to display patients, specifically designed to generate awe and pity and charitable giving. They are profiting from suffering, and they know it. But eventually, the tide begins to turn. By the mid-18th century, criticism of the visiting practice is growing. Enlightenment ideas about reason, humanity, and dignity are spreading. Physicians and reformers begin to argue that public visiting is not just cruel. It is medically harmful. Patients are subjected to constant stress. They are humiliated. They are provoked. They cannot heal in such an environment. In 1770, the Court of Governors makes a decision. Unrestricted public access will end. From now on, visitors will require a ticket signed by a governor to enter. The process is more controlled. The crowds thin. The holiday mob is no longer welcome. But here is the bitter irony. Some historians argue that this change, while well-intentioned, actually made things worse for the patients. Why? Because when the public could freely enter, there was at least a degree of oversight. Abuses might be witnessed, conditions might be reported. The hospital was, in some sense, accountable. But after 1770, behind closed doors, with only select visitors allowed in, the hospital becomes more opaque, more secretive, more willing to use harsher methods without fear of public outcry. The galleries fall silent, the crowds disperse, and behind those closed doors, the suffering continues, now unseen. The Moorfields building itself will stand for another 45 years after 1770. But it is not built to last. Hook's design, for all its grandeur, has fundamental flaws. The structure was erected with inconsiderate zeal and more haste than evident wisdom, as the hospital surveyor will later write. It was built over marshy ground, over the old city ditch, with inadequate foundations. By the early 1800s, the building is literally falling apart. Walls crack, floors sag. One wing is demolished in 1805 for safety reasons. In 1810, the governors begin negotiating to move the hospital once again, this time to St. George's Fields in Southwark. In 1815, the entire Moorfields structure is condemned as incurable, a grimly appropriate diagnosis for a hospital dedicated to treating the incurable. The building is dismantled. Its masonry is auctioned off piece by piece. The only thing saved, raving and melancholy madness. Cibber's statues are carefully removed from the gates and transported to the new site, where they will continue to guard the entrance. Though by then, sensibilities have begun to change. Eventually, the statues will be deemed too disturbing, too grotesque, and they will be placed behind a curtain. But for now, in this moment between 1676 and 1815, they reign supreme. Two stone figures watching over a parade of suffering. The Moorfields era is the era when Bedlam becomes Bedlam in the popular imagination. It is when the hospital transforms from a quiet institution of containment into a public spectacle. When madness becomes entertainment. When suffering becomes tourism. When humanity becomes curiosity. The building itself, that grand palatial structure, was meant to project charity and benevolence. But what it projected, ultimately, was a society willing to profit from the display of human misery. And that is the legacy of Moorfields, not the elegant facade, not the innovative galleries, not the Baroque statues, but the simple fact that for nearly a century, Londoners lined up to laugh at the mad, and the hospital let them. Picture yourself in London, 1750. You are a visitor to the city, perhaps from the country, perhaps from abroad. You have come to see the sights, and you have been given a list of essential places to visit. The Tower of London, of course, Westminster Abbey, London Bridge, the Royal Menagerie, and Bethlem Hospital, Bedlam. It sits comfortably on that list, doesn't it? Right there alongside historic monuments and exotic animals. A place where, for the price of a penny, or sometimes nothing at all, you can spend an afternoon seeing something remarkable, something disturbing, something you'll remember for the rest of your life. You arrive on a pleasant spring morning. The building before you is magnificent, stretching endlessly across the landscape, its baroque facade gleaming in the light. Those two figures above the gates catch your eye immediately. Raving madness on one side, chained and writhing, melancholy madness on the other, slack and hollow-eyed. They are there to prepare you, to warn you, to promise you something extraordinary. You drop a coin in the poor box. The gates are already open. You walk in, and this is what you see. The first thing that strikes you is the space. You step into one of the great galleries, those long, bright corridors that run the entire length of the building. The floor is stone, the walls are whitewashed, light floods in from the enormous windows that line one side, looking north across the grounds. The gallery stretches ahead of you like a tunnel with no end, 13 feet high, 16 feet wide. The perspective seems to pull you forward, drawing you deeper into the building. It is, you must admit, impressive. On your left, windows, light, air. On your right, the cells, row after row after row of them. Each cell has a heavy wooden door, some closed, some open. Most have a small barred window, set into the door at eye level. A grate, really, through which you can see inside. Some cells have iron bars instead of doors, creating a kind of cage effect. The bars are sturdy. They are there for a reason. You approach the first cell. You peer inside. And here is where the reality begins. Inside the cell, a person. A man, perhaps, or a woman, sitting on a rough wooden bed, or standing by the window, or pacing, or lying on the floor. Some are quiet. They sit and stare at nothing. Their faces are blank, vacant. When you call to them, they do not respond. When you wave your hand in front of the grate, they do not seem to see you. They are somewhere else, somewhere you cannot reach. Others are not quiet. One woman is singing. Her voice is cracked, tuneless, but she sings with intensity, over and over. The same verse, the same melody. She does not stop when you approach. She does not stop when others laugh. A man in the next cell is shouting, not at anyone in particular, just shouting. Words tumble out of his mouth, accusations, prophecies, curses, fragments of sermons. His voice is hoarse. He has been shouting for hours, perhaps days. Another patient is naked, or nearly naked. His clothes have been torn to shreds, or he has torn them himself. He stands at the bars, gripping them with white knuckles, staring out at the visitors with wild, unfocused eyes. The smell is immediate, overpowering, unwashed bodies, urine, feces, straw bedding that has gone damp and mouldy. The cells are swept out, yes, but not often enough, and some patients cannot, or will not, use the chamber pots provided. The air is thick with it. You cover your nose with a handkerchief. You keep walking, but you are not here just to observe. You are here to engage. This is entertainment, after all. Up ahead, a small crowd has gathered around one of the cells. You push closer to see what has caught their attention. Inside, a man who believes he is the king. Not just any king, King Charles himself, or perhaps God, or perhaps both. His delusion changes depending on the day, but today he is regal, imperious, absurd in his madness. He wears a makeshift crown fashioned from straw and rags. He sits on his bed as if it were a throne. When visitors address him, he responds with grand gestures and proclamations. "Your Majesty," someone calls mockingly, "what are your orders for the kingdom?" The man rises. He sweeps his arm dramatically. "Bring me wine," he commands. "Bring me my courtiers. Bring me my enemies so that I may show them mercy." Laughter ripples through the crowd. Someone tosses him a crust of bread. "Here, your Majesty, a feast." More laughter. The man accepts the bread solemnly, as if it were a precious gift from a foreign dignitary. He bows. He thanks his subjects. He eats it with exaggerated ceremony. The crowd is delighted. This is what they came for. But not all interactions are so benign. Further down the gallery, you see a group of young men, gentlemen by their dress, standing outside another cell. They are calling out to the patient inside, a woman who has been here for years. "Show us your legs, darling. Come closer to the bars. Give us a smile, won't you?" The woman does not respond. She sits hunched in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking gently back and forth. One of the men picks up a small stone from the floor. He tosses it through the bars. It strikes the woman's shoulder. She flinches but does not look up. "Come on now," he calls. "Don't be shy." His friends laugh. They move on. A warder, one of the hospital keepers, is walking through the gallery. He is carrying a long stick. When he sees a patient becoming too loud, too disruptive, he raps the stick against the cell bars. Clang, clang, clang. Quiet in there. But the warder is also watching the visitors. He knows his job. He knows what brings them here. When he passes a cell where the patient is particularly entertaining, he stops. He addresses the crowd. "This one's a good show," he says. "Watch this." He raps his stick against the bars. He calls to the patient. He provokes a reaction. The patient, a man who has been sitting quietly, suddenly explodes into fury. He rushes at the bars, screaming, clawing at the iron. His face is contorted with rage. Spittle flies from his mouth. The crowd gasps. Some step back, others leaning closer. The warder grins. He extends his hand, palm up. A visitor drops a coin into it. Part of the draw, part of what makes visiting Bethlem so appealing, is the possibility of seeing someone famous. Someone whose fall from grace has been public. Someone whose madness is a cautionary tale. Someone who was once respectable, celebrated even, and is now this. In the 1680s, visitors come specifically to see Nathaniel Lee. Lee, the playwright. Once, his works were performed at the Theatre Royal. He wrote tragedies. He wrote historical dramas. He was admired, successful, wealthy. And then his mind broke. Now he is here, confined to a cell. Subject to the same gawking crowds as everyone else. Visitors peer in at him. They whisper, "That's Lee, the playwright. Can you believe it? Pure man. What a waste." Some feel genuine pity. Others feel something closer to schadenfreude. Look how the mighty have fallen. Lee himself, by some accounts, retains his wit even in madness. Upon his eventual release years later, he will reportedly say, "They called me mad, and I called them mad, and damn them, they outvoted me." But for now, he is simply another exhibit, another story to tell at dinner parties. What is the atmosphere like in these galleries? Imagine noise, constant noise, screaming, singing, laughing, weeping, shouting, the rattle of chains, the clang of bars being struck, the shuffling of feet, both patients and visitors, the murmur of conversations, the occasional gasp or shriek from a visitor who has seen something particularly shocking. It is cacophony. One contemporary observer describes it as cryings, screechings, roarings, brawlings, shaking of chains, swearings, frettings, chaffings. Lady Eleanor Davies, who spent time in Bethlem in the 1630s, compared it to hell. Such were the blasphemies and the noisome scents. It is not a place of healing. It is not a place of rest. It is not even really a place of containment. It is a stage. And the patients are the performers, whether they want to be or not. But surely, you might think, not everyone who visits is cruel. Surely some come with good intentions. Surely some believe they are doing something worthwhile. And you would be right, because alongside the mockers and the pleasure seekers are those who genuinely believe that visiting Bedlam serves a moral purpose. One mid-18th century commentator writes, "There is no better lesson to be taught us in any part of the globe than in this school of misery." The argument goes like this: by witnessing madness, by seeing what happens when reason is overthrown by passion, when virtue gives way to vice, when the mind collapses, the visitor learns to be moderate, to be virtuous, to be grateful for their own sanity. Madness, in this view, is a warning. It shows you what can happen if you lose control, if you drink too much, if you gamble, if you indulge in excess, if you stray from the path of reason and morality. So, visiting Bethlem becomes, for some, an act of self-improvement, a reminder, a lesson, a form of moral education. There but for the grace of God go I. But let us be honest, for the vast majority of visitors, this is not why they come. They come because it is entertaining. They come because it is shocking. They come because it is transgressive. A chance to see something that, in any other context, they would not be allowed to see. A chance to peer into the private suffering of others without consequence. They come for what historian Roy Porter calls the frisson of the freak show. And Bethlem, for nearly a century, gives them exactly what they want. In 1699, a satirical writer named Ned Ward visits Bethlem and records his experience in his periodical, The London Spy. Ward is not a gentle observer. He writes with brutal honesty about what he sees and about what the visit reveals, not just about the patients, but about the visitors themselves. He describes the scene in vivid, uncomfortable detail. The crowds moving through the galleries, the laughter, the provocations, the way visitors tire themselves with the frantic humours and rambling ejaculations of the patients. But Ward also hints at something darker. He suggests, subtly but unmistakably, that the visit to Bethlem is not just about entertainment. It is also about sexuality, about power, about the satisfaction of urges that polite society does not acknowledge. The galleries of Bethlem, Ward implies, offer visitors a kind of license, a space where normal rules do not apply, where they can indulge in cruelty, in voyeurism, in things they would never admit to in daylight. He writes, "Having pretty well tired ourselves with the frantic humours and rambling ejaculations of the mad folk," and then he moves on to describe the rest of his night, which includes visits to brothels and taverns and other sites of London's underworld. The implication is clear. Visiting Bedlam is not so different from these other pursuits. It is vice dressed up as virtue. It is cruelty dressed up as charity. It is exploitation dressed up as education. In 1735, the artist William Hogarth publishes the final plate of his series, A Rake's Progress. The series tells the story of Tom Rakewell, a young man who inherits wealth, moves to London, and squanders everything on gambling, prostitution, and luxury. By the final image, Tom has lost his mind and is confined to Bethlem Hospital. Plate 8, The Rake in Bedlam, is one of the most famous depictions of Bethlem ever created. Tom lies on the floor, nearly naked, shackled, writhing in madness. His pose deliberately mimics Cibber's statue of raving madness at the hospital gates. Around him are other patients, each lost in their own delusions. And in the background, two fashionable ladies. They have come to Bethlem as a social outing. One peers through the bars at a patient, amused. The other fans herself delicately, as if she were at the theatre. A gentleman accompanies them, equally entertained. They are not here to help. They are not here to learn. They are here because it is fashionable. Because visiting Bedlam is something one does. Hogarth's message is devastating. Tom's moral degradation has brought him to this place. But the visitors, the so-called respectable people, are no better. They profit from his suffering. They are entertained by his ruin. They are complicit. The image becomes iconic. For generations afterward, when people think of Bedlam, they will think of Hogarth's depiction. The chaos, the degradation, the cruelty of the spectacle. Now step back. Step out of the visitor's perspective and imagine for a moment what this experience is like for the patients. You are unwell. Your mind is not working the way it should. You are frightened, confused, sometimes in pain. You have been brought to this place, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force. You have been confined to a cell. The door is locked. You cannot leave. And then, 6 days a week, strangers come. They peer at you through the bars. They call to you. They mock you. They throw things at you. They provoke you to see if you will react. If you are quiet, they are disappointed. If you scream, they are delighted. You are not a person to them. You are a curiosity, an animal in a zoo, a performer on a stage, a lesson, a warning, a joke. There is no privacy. There is no dignity. There is no rest. Every day, the crowds come, and you cannot escape them. One 18th century observer records seeing 100 people at least, running rioting up and down the wards, making sport and diversion of the miserable inhabitants. Some patients, the observer notes, were provoked by the insults of this holiday mob into furies of rage. The visitors laugh, the patients suffer, and the hospital collects its donations. Here is the uncomfortable question. Was it better when Bethlem was open to the public? Because at least then, there was visibility. At least then, abuses could be witnessed. At least then, conditions could be reported. At least then, there was some degree of accountability. After 1770, when the Court of Governors restricted public access and required visitors to have a ticket signed by a governor, the crowds stopped coming. The galleries fell silent, and behind those closed doors, away from public scrutiny, the hospital became more willing to use harsher methods, more brutal treatments, more extreme forms of restraint. The suffering did not end. It simply became invisible. And in some ways, that was worse. But let us not romanticize the public visiting era either. Because what happened in those galleries between 1676 and 1770 was not oversight. It was not accountability. It was not compassion. It was exploitation, pure and simple. The patients were made to perform their suffering for profit. Their dignity was stripped away. Their humanity was reduced to spectacle. And London, wealthy, enlightened, increasingly sophisticated London, paid money to watch. So what did visitors see when they walked through the galleries of Bethlem Hospital? They saw people in crisis, people in pain, people who needed help and received confinement instead. But they did not see them as people. They saw them as entertainment, as lessons, as warnings, as freaks. And that is the tragedy of the spectacle. Not just what happened to the patients, but what it revealed about the visitors, about us, about what humans are capable of when suffering is made safe to watch, when cruelty is sanctioned, when exploitation is dressed up as charity. The galleries of Bethlem were not just a window into madness. They were a mirror. And what they reflected was not pretty. In October 1728, a Scottish physician named James Monro is elected physician to Bethlem Hospital. He is 48 years old, well-educated, well-connected, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, the son of Alexander Monro, who had once been principal of the University of Edinburgh, before fleeing to England for his Jacobite sympathies. James Monro's appointment seems unremarkable at the time. Just another physician taking up a position at one of London's charitable institutions. But this appointment will mark the beginning of something unprecedented in British medical history, a dynasty. For the next 125 years, the position of physician at Bethlem Hospital will be controlled by a single family. 4 generations, father to son to grandson to great-grandson. An unbroken line of Monros, each inheriting not just the position, but the philosophy, the methods, and ultimately the reputation. James Monro from 1728 to 1752. John Monro from 1752 to 1791. Thomas Monro from 1792 to 1816. Edward Thomas Monro from 1816 to 1853. They will become known as the Mad Doctors. And under their care, Bethlem will descend into its darkest era. James Monro begins his tenure during a time when the understanding of mental illness is still rooted firmly in medieval thinking. Humoral theory dominates medical practice. The belief is this: the body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humours are in balance, a person is healthy. When they are out of balance, illness results. Madness, therefore, is seen as a physical imbalance. An excess of black bile causes melancholy. An excess of blood causes mania. The solution? Restore balance. And how do you restore balance? You remove the excess. Bloodletting, purging, vomiting, sweating. These are not seen as punishments. They are seen as medicine. James Monro is described by his son John as a man of admirable discernment, and treated this disease, insanity, with an address that will not soon be equalled. But what does that treatment actually look like? We have fragmentary records, accounts from visitors, complaints from former patients. One writer, Alexander Cruden, a religious activist who was briefly incarcerated in Bethlem and despised the experience, writes bitterly, "But is there so great merit and dexterity in being a mad doctor? The common prescriptions of a Bethlem-mytical doctor are a purge and a vomit and a purge over again, and sometimes a bleeding, which is no great mystery. Simple, repetitive, brutal. But James Monro is establishing something more important than treatment protocols. He is establishing precedent. The idea that this position, physician to Bethlem, can be passed down like property, like inheritance. That expertise in treating madness is something that runs in families. When James dies in 1752, his eldest son John is already waiting. Thomas Monro is perhaps the most complex figure in the dynasty. Born in 1759, he is educated at Harrow and Oriel College, Oxford, graduating as a Doctor of Medicine in 1787. Like his father and grandfather before him, he becomes a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. He delivers the Harveian oration in 1799. But Thomas is not just a physician. He is also a patron of the arts. He runs an informal art school known as the Monro Circle, where young artists gather at his home to study drawing and watercolour. Among his protégés, J. Maidiliu Turner, who will become one of Britain's greatest painters. Thomas Monro is cultured, refined, connected to London's intellectual elite. And yet, it is during Thomas Monro's tenure that Bethlem reaches the nadir of its cruelty. The treatments. Under Thomas Monro, the arsenal of treatments expands, though expands is perhaps too generous a word. It is more accurate to say that the methods become more systematic, more frequent, more brutal. Bloodletting. Patients are bled regularly, sometimes with lancets, sometimes with leeches applied to the temples, neck, or other parts of the body. The belief is that removing blood will reduce the pressure on the brain, calm the patient, restore balance. One account describes dozens of leeches applied to a single patient in one session. The patient, already weakened by malnutrition and confinement, loses consciousness. This is seen as a good sign. The treatment is working. Purging and vomiting. Patients are given powerful emetics, substances that induce vomiting, and purgatives, substances that cause violent diarrhea. The goal? To empty the body of excess humours. The reality? Dehydration, weakness, and sometimes death. William Black, a physician writing in 1811, describes the standard Bethlem protocol. In Bedlam, the strait waistcoat when necessary, and occasional purgatives are the principal remedies. He goes on to mention venesection, bloodletting, leeches, cupping glasses, and the inducing of blisters, burning or irritating the skin to create wounds that draw out illness. Cold baths. Patients are plunged into ice-cold water, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. The shock is meant to reset the mind. Instead, it often induces hypothermia, panic, and trauma. One patient describes being held underwater until he thought he would drown. Another describes being forced into a bath so cold that he lost feeling in his limbs. Starvation. Food is withheld as punishment or as treatment. A reduced diet, it is believed, will calm the passions, will make the patient more manageable. Hunger becomes another tool of control. Beatings. Despite official prohibitions, physical violence remains common. Warders strike patients who resist treatment. Patients who scream are beaten into silence. Patients who refuse food are beaten until they eat. The violence is routine, casual, unremarked upon. Mechanical restraints, straitjackets, chains, manacles, leg irons. Some patients are restrained for hours, some for days, some for years. And then there is rotational therapy. The spinning chair. It begins with an idea. Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin, physician, poet, inventor, publishes his Zoonomia in the 1790s. In it, he describes a device, a chair or bed suspended from a rotating pole. The concept is simple. Spin the patient rapidly around a vertical axis. The resulting vertigo, nausea, and disorientation will shock the mind back into balance. Darwin himself never builds the device. He never uses it on patients. He simply sketches the idea and publishes it. But others take notice. In 1804, an English physician named Joseph Mason Cox builds the first functional version. He calls it the circulating swing. Others will call it Cox's chair, and it will become one of the most notorious treatments in the history of psychiatry. Imagine a sturdy wooden chair suspended from the ceiling by thick ropes or chains, or sometimes attached to a vertical pole that extends from floor to ceiling. The patient is strapped into the chair, arms pinned, legs secured, head immobilized with a brace or mask to prevent neck injury. They cannot move, they cannot escape, they can only sit and wait. An attendant begins to turn the chair, slowly at first, then faster, faster still. The chair spins 100 rotations per minute in some documented cases. The world becomes a blur. The patient's inner ear, the vestibular system that controls balance, is overwhelmed. The brain receives conflicting signals. The eyes see motion, but the body feels stillness. Vertigo sets in immediately, then nausea, then terror. The patient begins to scream, to beg, to vomit. The vomit is seen as therapeutic. The doctor does not stop. The spinning continues, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. Eventually, the patient loses consciousness, or voids their bowels and bladder, or simply goes limp, all fight drained from their body. When the chair finally stops, the patient is lifted out, pale, trembling, soaked in their own fluids, and the doctor records treatment successful, patient now calm. Cox describes the circulating swing as a Herculean remedy, strong medicine for a strong illness. He writes that it has several benefits. It induces sleep in manic patients, making opiates unnecessary. It creates a state of submission. Patients become more cooperative after treatment. It resets the mind, restoring balance to the humours. Other physicians echo these claims. William Halloran, who superintends the Cork Lunatic Asylum in Ireland, builds a version that can spin 4 patients at once. He writes with satisfaction, "Since the commencement of its use, I have never been at a loss for establishing supreme authority over the most turbulent and unruly." Read that again. Supreme authority. This is not about healing. This is about control. Interestingly, Halloran also notes something else. Some patients enjoyed the experience. After the initial sessions, they would ask to be spun again, voluntarily, as a form of amusement. This suggests that, at lower speeds and shorter durations, the spinning might have had mild mood-altering effects, perhaps calming, perhaps stimulating. But that is not how it was typically used. It was used at maximum intensity, as punishment, as coercion, as a means of breaking the will. Modern studies have revisited rotational therapy. In 2013, researchers in Germany tested a controlled version using a 3D spinning chair. They found that yaw rotation, spinning around a vertical axis, could produce mild changes in mood states. Some subjects reported feeling more comfortable or alert afterward. But the historical applications were nothing like these controlled experiments. Patients were spun until they vomited, until they fainted, until they evacuated their bowels. Doctors could adjust the speed on a scale between nausea and unmerciful evacuation. Unmerciful evacuation. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. Retrospective studies describe the method as having been subject to abusive applications. Abusive, not experimental, not misguided, Not well-intentioned, but flawed, abusive. Cox's chair is widely adopted across Europe in the early 19th century. It appears in asylums in England, France, Germany, Italy. By the 1820s, it begins to fall out of favour, not because it is recognised as cruel, but because it is seen as ineffective. The patients do not improve. They simply become more broken. And eventually, even the doctors lose interest. The chairs are dismantled, the poles removed, the innovation forgotten. But its legacy remains. A century later, the principles of rotational stimulation will be adapted for the Bharani chair, used in aerospace training and vestibular research. And today, you can still find echoes of Cox's chair at every carnival and amusement park in the world. The spinning teacups, the tilt-a-whirl, the rides that make you scream and laugh and vomit. Entertainment now, torture then. But Thomas Monro is not the only architect of Bethlem's horrors. In 1795, he appoints an apothecary named John Asylum. Asylum will serve at Bethlem for nearly 2 decades, and his philosophy is chilling in its clarity. He believes that in order to cure the mentally ill, you must first break them. Break their will, break their resistance, break their sense of self. Only then can they be rebuilt. This is not metaphor. Asylum implements a regime of systematic brutality. Patients who resist are chained. Patients who scream are gagged. Patients who fight back are beaten until they submit. Asylum views mental illness as a failure of discipline. The cure, therefore, is discipline. Harsh, unrelenting, absolute. Under Asylum's watch, restraints become more elaborate, more cruel. And one case, above all others, will eventually bring the entire system crashing down. What is life like for a patient at Bethlem during this era? Let us construct a typical day. Morning. You wake on a rough wooden bed, if you are fortunate enough to have one. Some patients sleep on straw on the floor, particularly in the basement galleries where the incurables are kept. The cell is cold, unheated, even in winter. The only warmth comes from your own body and perhaps a thin blanket, if you have not destroyed it in a fit of mania or had it taken away as punishment. The window, unglazed, just iron bars, lets in the morning air. It is freezing. You have not bathed in weeks, perhaps months. The smell in your cell is overpowering. Your own unwashed body, the chamber pot, which may or may not have been emptied yesterday. The damp stone walls, the mold growing in the corners. An attendant unlocks your door. Up, time for your medicine? Medicine. You are given a cup of something bitter, an emetic, perhaps, or a purgative. You do not know. You only know that within an hour you will be violently sick. You drink it. You have no choice. Midday. Your cell door remains locked most of the time. You are allowed out for brief periods, to use the single toilet at the end of the gallery, shared by dozens of patients, or to walk in the exercise yard if you are deemed safe enough. But mostly, you sit, or pace, or lie on your bed staring at the ceiling. There is nothing to do, no books, no activities, no meaningful human contact beyond the perfunctory interactions with attendants. If you are agitated, if you shout, if you try to harm yourself, if you refuse to obey, you are restrained. A straitjacket is pulled over your arms, binding them tightly across your chest, or chains are attached to your wrists and ankles, or, if you are particularly troublesome, both. You are left like this for hours, sometimes days. Afternoon. Perhaps today is a treatment day. An attendant comes for you. You are taken to another room, cold, stone-walled, dimly lit. The physician is there, or the apothecary, or sometimes just the warders. You are told to sit, roll up your sleeve, a lancet is produced. They open a vein in your arm, blood flows into a basin, dark, thick, your life draining away in measured amounts. They take a pint, sometimes more. You feel lightheaded, weak. There, that should calm you. Or perhaps, instead, they apply leeches. 3, 4, 5 of them attached to your temples. You feel them writhing against your skin, sucking, swelling with your blood. Or perhaps today is a purging day. You are given another draught, something that will empty your bowels violently, painfully, for hours. Or perhaps today you are taken to the baths. The water is ice cold. You are held down, immersed. You gasp. You struggle. They hold you under. Evening. You are returned to your cell. Food is brought, a small portion of bread, perhaps some thin gruel, occasionally meat, though it is often rancid. You are hungry, but the treatments have made you nauseous. You eat what you can. The door locks. Night falls. In the galleries around you, other patients are screaming, singing, weeping, praying. The noise is constant. It never stops. You lie on your bed. You do not sleep well. You have not slept well in months. Tomorrow will be the same. And the day after that, and the day after that. This is not treatment. This is endurance. And for many, it will continue for years. Some will recover, not because of the treatments, but in spite of them. Their conditions will improve naturally, or their families will pay for their release, or they will simply learn to perform sanity convincingly enough to be discharged. Others will not be so fortunate. They will be transferred to the incurable ward, and they will die here. In the basement galleries, chained to beds of straw, surrounded by their own filth, forgotten by everyone except the attendants, who bring their meagre meals, and the physicians who record their symptoms with clinical detachment. The treatments at Bethlem are so severe that the hospital develops an unofficial policy. Refuse admission to patients deemed too frail to survive treatment. Read that again. The treatments are so violent, so physically taxing, that the hospital will not admit patients who might die from them. Not because dying is seen as wrong, but because it is seen as inconvenient. It reflects poorly on the institution. Better to turn away the weak and keep the strong. Those who can endure the bloodletting, the purging, the spinning, the cold baths, the beatings. Those who can survive being cured. And still, many do not survive. Modern archaeological investigations have uncovered mass graves on the Bethlem property, dating back to the 1560s, estimated to contain around 20,000 bodies. 20,000. These are not soldiers, not victims of plague. These are patients. People who entered Bethlem seeking help, or were dragged there by families who could no longer cope, and who died under its care. Some died of their illnesses. Some died of malnutrition. Some died of infections. Some died from the treatments themselves. And they were buried unceremoniously, nameless, in pits dug on the hospital grounds. By the early 1800s, the Monro Dynasty is at the height of its power. Thomas Monro is consulted by the royal physicians during King George III's final episode of madness in 1811 to 1812. He charges £500 for his services, a staggering sum. He is never actually introduced to the king himself. He carries, as one observer notes, the baggage of being the mad doctor from Bedlam. But his opinion is sought, and his authority acknowledged. The Monros have become synonymous with the treatment of insanity in England. They are powerful, they are wealthy, they are untouchable, or so they believe. But in 1814, something happens that will shatter their monopoly. A Quaker philanthropist named Edward Wakefield walks through the doors of Bethlem, and what he finds will change everything. Spring 1814. A man named Edward Wakefield approaches the gates of Bethlem Hospital in Moorfields. He is 40 years old, a Quaker, a land agent by profession. He established his business just that year at 42 Pall Mall, but his interests extend far beyond property. He is known as a philanthropist, a statistician, a practical man concerned with social reform. He has heard things about Bethlem, disturbing things. And so, on this spring day, he arrives at the gates, past those two stone figures, raving in melancholy madness, still keeping their eternal watch, and requests entry. The hospital, remember, no longer allows unrestricted public access. Since 1770, visitors have required a ticket signed by a governor. But Wakefield is not an ordinary visitor. He has connections. He has brought with him a member of Parliament and, crucially, a governor of the hospital itself. The doors open, and what Edward Wakefield sees over the course of multiple visits during the late spring and early summer of 1814 will trigger a chain of events that will end the Monro Dynasty, transform public attitudes toward mental illness, and ultimately reshape the entire system of asylum care in England. But first, he must witness. The building itself is falling apart. That grand palatial structure, erected with such pride in 1676, is now in its 138th year. The foundations, laid hastily over marshy ground, over the old city ditch, are failing. Walls are cracked, floors sag, entire sections of the building are uninhabitable. The patient population has been significantly reduced. Those who can be moved have been transferred elsewhere. Only the most severe cases remain, and they remain in conditions that shock even a hardened observer. Wakefield finds that patients in the galleries are not classified in any logical manner. Both highly disturbed and quiescent patients are mixed together indiscriminately. There is no attempt at therapeutic separation, no order, no system. Many patients are naked, or nearly naked, their clothes torn to shreds, or taken away as punishment. They sit on straw in their cells, exposed to the cold air that streams through the unglazed barred windows. Many are chained. Wakefield witnesses naked, starved men chained to the walls, sometimes with thick iron rings around their necks. The chains are not brief restraints applied temporarily during moments of crisis. They are permanent. Some patients have been chained for months, years, decades. Wakefield seeks to describe their conditions in such a way as to maximize the horror of the scene, while decrying the apparently bestial treatment of inmates and the thuggish nature of the asylum keepers. He is not exaggerating. He is, if anything, understating what he sees. And then Wakefield finds him, in a cell in one of the long galleries, a man, an American. His name is James Norris, though some accounts will mistakenly call him William. He is a former seaman, admitted to Bethlem on February 1st, 1800. He is now 55 years old, and he has been confined in an iron harness for more than 10 years. Let us describe this harness precisely, because the details matter. A stout iron ring is riveted round his neck, from which a short chain passes through a ring made to slide upwards and downwards on an upright iron bar fastened to the wall. Round his body a strong iron bar about 2 inches wide is riveted. On each side of the bar is a circular projection, which being fashioned to and enclosing each of his arms, pinions them close to his sides. This waist bar is secured by 2 similar iron bars, which, passing over his shoulders, are riveted to the waist, both before and behind. The iron ring about his neck is connected to the bars on his shoulders by a double link. Read that again. Slowly, try to picture it. An iron collar around his neck, iron bars over his shoulders, riveted to an iron waistband, his arms pinned to his sides by circular iron projections. All of this connected by chains to an upright bar fixed to the wall. He can move perhaps 12 inches in any direction. He can sit. He can stand with difficulty. He cannot lie down properly. He cannot raise his arms. He cannot turn his body freely. He cannot escape. He has remained thus encaged and chained for more than 12 years. 12 years, not 12 days, not 12 weeks, 12 years. Why? According to hospital records, Norris had been admitted in 1800 and so terrorized the small staff that in June 1804 he was permanently confined in an iron harness. He was violent, they say, dangerous, unmanageable. Perhaps that was true in 1804, but it is now 1814. And Norris has not been violent in years, because Norris cannot be violent. He is broken. When Wakefield speaks to him, Norris is lucid, articulate. He converses rationally. He understands his situation. He knows he has been confined for more than a decade. But he is also clearly unwell, malnourished, pale, weak. The harness is attached to chains which the staff would pull at random intervals, slamming him into the wall. This is not restraint. This is torture, and it has been sanctioned by the hospital, by the apothecary, John Asylum, by the physician, Thomas Monro, by the governors who oversee the institution for 12 years. Wakefield is horrified, not just by Norris, though Norris becomes the symbol, the focal point, but by everything he has witnessed: the naked, starving patients, the chains, the filth, the casual cruelty of the warders, the complete absence of anything resembling care. He leaves Bethlem and begins to write. Wakefield is not working alone. He is joined by 2 allies, William Hone, 1780 to 1842, a political writer and publisher known for his satirical work and his willingness to challenge authority. James Bevans, an architect with a keen eye for the physical failures of the building, but also a humanitarian concerned with the failures of the system. Together, they campaign for change in the conditions for patients, not only in Bedlam but throughout England. They write articles, they petition MPs, they commission artwork. George Cruikshank is hired to etch Norris's portrait, including the inscription, "Sketch from the Life in Bethlem, 7th June 1814, by G. Arnold, Esquimaux, ARA, etched by G. Cruikshank, from the original drawing exhibited to the Select Committee of the House of Commons on Madhouses, 1815. The image is devastating. It shows Norris standing, barely standing, in his iron harness. His arms are pinned, the chains are visible. His face wears an expression of resigned suffering. It is a portrait of a man who has been turned into a fixture, a human being reduced to furniture. And when the public sees it, the outrage is immediate. Wakefield's revelations are published in newspapers. They circulate in pamphlets. They are discussed in coffee houses, in drawing rooms, in Parliament itself. The questions are obvious. How could this be allowed? Who is responsible? What else is happening behind those closed doors? And crucially, if this is happening at Bethlem, the most famous, most established institution in England, what is happening in private madhouses across the country? The pressure builds. In April 1815, the House of Commons establishes a select committee on madhouses. The inquiry has begun. The Select Committee on Madhouses is tasked with investigating conditions under which the insane are confined, not just at Bethlem, but in county asylums, private madhouses, charitable institutions, and the lunatic wards of poor law workhouses. But Bethlem is the focus, because Bethlem is the symbol. Witnesses are called. Edward Wakefield testifies about his visits. He describes what he saw. He presents the etching of James Norris. He speaks with measured passion about the systemic failures of the institution. John Haslam is called to testify, and it does not go well for him. Haslam is brilliant. There is no denying that. His earlier publications, particularly Illustrations of Madness, 1810, had established him as an authority on mental illness. His case study of James Tilly Matthews, a patient who believed he was being tormented by a machine called the heirloom, is one of the first detailed descriptions of what we would now recognize as paranoid schizophrenia. But brilliance is not the same as humanity. When questioned about Norris, Haslam is defensive. He justifies the harness as necessary, as the only way to manage a dangerous patient. When asked why Norris remained in the harness for 12 years, even after he ceased to be dangerous, Haslam has no good answer. When asked about other cases of prolonged restraint, other instances of patients being chained to walls, left naked, denied food, Haslam deflects. He blames inadequate staffing. He blames the patients themselves. He does not take responsibility. Thomas Monro is also called. He is accused of being wanting in humanity towards his patients. Monro, like Haslam, is a complex figure. He is cultured, refined, a patron of J.M.W. Turner, a watercolor enthusiast, an art collector whose Monro Circle has shaped British landscape painting. But as a physician, he has been absent. Day-to-day operations at Bethlem have largely been left to Haslam. Monro visits occasionally, approves treatments, signs off on decisions, but he is not present. He does not see the patients regularly. He does not witness the conditions in which they live. And when confronted with the evidence, when presented with the reality of Norris, of naked patients chained in cells, of a building falling apart around its inmates, Monro cannot mount an effective defense. He claims ignorance. He claims he trusted his staff. He claims the patients required harsh treatment. None of it is convincing. The committee's findings are damning. Bethlem Hospital is found to have systematically failed in its duty of care. Patients have been subjected to prolonged and unnecessary mechanical restraint, physical abuse by warders, inadequate nutrition, exposure to cold and unsanitary conditions, lack of proper medical supervision, complete absence of any therapeutic intervention. The committee does not mince words. The emphasis has increasingly shifted from the external control of the mad through physical restraint and coercion to their moral management, whereby self-discipline would be inculcated through a system of reward and punishment. Bethlem represents the old way, the brutal way, the way that sees patients as prisoners to be contained, rather than as people to be helped. For proponents of lunacy reform, the Quaker-run York Retreat, founded in 1796, functions as an exemplar of this new approach that would seek to re-socialize and re-educate the mad. Bethlem, embroiled in scandal from 1814, would come to symbolize its antithesis. The York Retreat does not chain its patients. It does not starve them. It does not spin them in chairs or plunge them in ice baths. It treats them with kindness, with respect, with the assumption that, even in madness, they remain human. And it achieves better outcomes than Bethlem. The message is clear. Change is not just morally necessary. It is medically effective. In 1816, the consequences arrive. John Haslam is dismissed by the governors. After 21 years as apothecary at Bethlem, he is removed from his position. He is financially ruined and is forced to sell his entire library. Haslam insists that he has been sacrificed to public clamour and party spirit. He maintains that his treatments were medically sound, that he was following best practices, that he has been made a scapegoat. Perhaps there is some truth to that. Haslam did not invent these methods. He inherited them. He applied the theories that had been taught to him, that had been sanctioned by generations of physicians before him. But he also showed no mercy, no compassion, no willingness to question whether what he was doing was causing more harm than good. And so, in 1816, at age 52, John Haslam finds himself unemployed, disgraced, and without a pension. He will eventually rebuild his career, obtaining a medical degree from Aberdeen, establishing a private practice, even becoming a licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians in 1824. But he will never recover his reputation. He dies at 56 Lamb's Conduit Street, London, on July 20th, 1844, aged 80. Thomas Monro does not fare much better. In June 1816, he resigns as a result of the scandal. Or rather, he is not re-elected by the Court of Governors. It amounts to the same thing. His tenure is over. The first Monro in charge at Bethlem was James in 1728, followed by John in 1751, then Thomas in 1787. The dynasty was badly damaged by the firing of Thomas Monro in 1815. 88 years of unbroken Monro control ended. Thomas Monro withdraws to his country house near Bushey in Hertfordshire. He continues to practice medicine privately, consulting on cases of insanity. He maintains his art collection. He sketches landscapes. He dies on May 14th, 1833, at age 74. His obituaries acknowledge his contributions to art and medicine. They do not dwell on Bethlem. And what of James Norris? After exposure in 1814, Norris is released from his restraints. After 12 years, finally, he can move his arms. He can lie down. He can walk more than 12 inches. But it is too late. The conditions he has endured for more than 10 years have so weakened his constitution that he dies within a few weeks of his release, of either pneumonia or tuberculosis. His body, broken by confinement, cannot recover. James Norris never leaves Bethlem alive. He enters in 1800, seeking or forced into treatment. He is placed in iron in 1804. He is discovered in 1814. He is freed in 1814. And he dies in 1814, in that same cell. Still a patient, still confined, just no longer in chains. The case of James Norris and the public interest it creates is instrumental in the creation of the Madhouse Act of 1828, which seeks to license and regulate asylums for the insane and to improve the treatment of the insane. His suffering, displayed in that etching, becomes a rallying point for reform. He becomes a symbol, a martyr, almost, but he is never free. Here is the bitter irony. Despite the scandal, despite the disgrace, despite the public outrage, the Monro Dynasty does not end. On his father's resignation in 1816, Edward Thomas Monro is appointed as principal physician of Bethlem Hospital, the fourth of his family in direct line to hold that position. Edward Thomas Monro, Thomas's son. He takes over the position immediately, the fourth generation. To be fair to Edward, he does attempt some reforms. Under his tenure, the use of mechanical restraint begins to decline, though it does not disappear entirely. The building itself is finally abandoned. In 1815, the entire institution moves to a new site in St. George's Fields, Suffolk, the building that will later house the Imperial War Museum. The Moorfields structure, that grand palace of madness, is demolished. Its materials are sold off piece by piece. Only the statues survive. Raving and melancholy madness are carefully removed and transported to the new location, where they continue to stand guard, though by now their imagery is beginning to be seen as distasteful. Eventually, they will be hidden behind a curtain. But Edward Thomas Monro's tenure is not without controversy. He continues to use treatments that are increasingly seen as outdated and barbaric: bloodletting, purging, restraints. In 1851, the Lunacy Committee is granted permission to investigate allegations of mistreatment at Bethlem. Again, the outcome of the investigation shows mismanagement, mistreatment, and abuse to the patients. Edward Thomas Monro's association with Bethlem ends shortly after. He dies on January 25th, 1856. And with his death, the Monro Dynasty at Bethlem finally ends. 125 years, 4 generations, from 1728 to 1853. But the reforms sparked by Wakefield's investigation extend far beyond Bethlem. The 1815 Select Committee's findings lead to the Madhouse Act of 1828, which requires licensing and regular inspection of all asylums, the establishment of county asylums across England, funded by local authorities, a gradual shift from restraint-based care to moral treatment, a philosophy that emphasizes kindness, occupation, and structured routines, greater oversight and accountability for private madhouses, public awareness of the conditions in which the insane are kept. The York Retreat, that Quaker-run institution, founded in 1796, becomes the model. Patients there are treated with dignity. They are given work to do: gardening, sewing, carpentry, to occupy their minds and give them purpose. They eat proper meals, they wear clothes, they are not chained, and they recover at higher rates than patients in traditional asylums. The tide is turning, slowly, too slowly for those already suffering, but turning nonetheless. By the mid-19th century, the worst abuses of the Georgian era are beginning to be recognized as such. Rotational therapy falls out of favor. Prolonged mechanical restraint becomes rare. The idea that madness requires breaking the patient gives way to the idea that it requires healing the patient. It is not perfect. The Victorian asylums that replace places like Bethlem will have their own horrors: overcrowding, isolation, inadequate funding, experimental treatments that cause as much harm as the old methods. But at least the conversation has shifted. At least there is recognition that the mad are people, that they deserve care, not cruelty. That confinement alone is not treatment. In 1930, Bethlem Hospital moves one final time to Monk's Orchard in Beckenham, where it remains today as part of the National Health Service, providing modern psychiatric care. The building is unrecognizable from its earlier incarnations. The patients are called patients, not inmates. The staff are trained professionals, not warders with sticks. The treatments are evidence-based, not humoral theory and mechanical torture. But the name remains Bethlem Royal Hospital. And in the popular imagination, Bedlam still means chaos, madness, disorder. The word carries the weight of centuries. Edward Wakefield dies in 1854 at age 80. He is remembered primarily for his statistical work on Ireland, published in 1812. But his most important contribution may be those visits to Bethlem in the spring and summer of 1814. Those careful observations, that etching of James Norris, that willingness to see what others had ignored, to speak what others had silenced. And James Norris? He remains in that etching, forever frozen in iron, a man who became a symbol, who died so that others might be freed. His grave, if he has one, is unmarked, but his image endures. A reminder of what happens when medicine forgets humanity, when authority goes unchecked, when suffering becomes routine. The Monro Dynasty is over. The old Bethlem is demolished. The reforms have begun, but the memory remains, and it should remain. Because only by remembering what was done, only by facing the full horror of it, can we ensure it is not done again. In 1930, Bethlem Hospital moved one final time. It came to rest at Monk's Orchard in Beckenham, in what is now the London borough of Bromley. This time, the move was not driven by structural failure or public scandal. It was driven by a vision of something different, something better. The new site comprises 265 acres of former country estate, Bluebell Woods, an orchard planted in the 1940s, with over 200 apple and plum trees, open green spaces, gardens, fresh air. It looks nothing like the old Bedlam. No Baroque facade stretching endlessly across the landscape. No stone figures of raving and melancholy madness guarding the gates, though they were brought along and eventually placed in the museum. No long galleries with cells on one side and gawking visitors on the other. Instead, a campus designed for healing, for recovery, for humanity. In 1948, with the establishment of the National Health Service, Bethlem Royal Hospital merged with the Maudsley Hospital in Camberwell to form a postgraduate psychiatric teaching hospital. The Maudsley had been founded in 1923, named after Henry Maudsley, an eminent psychiatrist who had donated £40,000 toward its construction, with the vision of creating an urban centre for psychiatric teaching and research rather than an asylum. The merger was transformative. Together, Bethlem and the Maudsley became a centre of excellence, a place where the future of psychiatry would be shaped, where research could inform treatment, where teaching could train the next generation of mental health professionals. In 1999, the institutions became part of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, SEL-AM, one of Europe's largest mental health trusts, providing services to over 40,000 people annually. Today, Bethlem is closely associated with King's College London and the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. It is part of the King's Health Partners Academic Health Science Centre. It houses the National Institute for Health Research, NIH, our biomedical research centre for mental health. It is, by all measures, a modern psychiatric hospital, state-of-the-art facilities, evidence-based treatments, trained professionals, dignity, respect, care. But the name remains Bethlem Royal Hospital, and in the popular imagination, Bedlam still means chaos. The word carries the weight of centuries. In 1997, Bethlem Royal Hospital began planning celebrations for its 750th anniversary, 7.5 centuries since its founding. The hospital administration envisioned a celebration of longevity, resilience, institutional history. But not everyone saw it that way. Members of the psychiatric survivors movement, people who had been patients, who had experienced the mental health system firsthand, saw nothing to celebrate. Not in the original Bedlam, not in current practices, not in the history of coercion, restraint, and dehumanization that the name Bedlam represented. A campaign was launched, Reclaim Bedlam, led by Pete Shaughnessy, a London Irish bus driver who had himself been a psychiatric patient. The campaign was supported by hundreds of patients and ex-patients. Their message was clear. How can you celebrate lobotomy, lifetime institutionalization, taking your own life, depression, drug dependency, ECTs? A sit-in was held outside the earlier Bedlam site at the Imperial War Museum in Southwark, where the hospital had stood from 1815 to 1930. The campaign was covered widely in the media. The BBC made a documentary about it. And when the chief executive of Bethlem was scheduled to receive an MBE at a service at St. Paul's Cathedral, protesters stopped traffic, forced Tower Bridge to open using a boat, and ensured he didn't make it in time. The fight, they said, was not just about Bedlam. It was about the British Empire and the decorations of imperialism. It was about power, control, and who gets to define madness. It was about whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. The historian Roy Porter supported their position, calling Bethlem Hospital a symbol for man's inhumanity to man, for callousness and cruelty. The hospital's response was complicated. In 1997, the same year as the protest, the Bethlem Gallery was established, specifically to showcase the work of artists who have experienced mental distress. It was, perhaps, an acknowledgement, a recognition that the voices of patients matter, that their creativity, their perspective, their humanity deserves space. Pete Shaughnessy went on to co-found Mad Pride, a movement celebrating neurodiversity, resisting coercion, and reclaiming the language of madness as a source of identity and power, rather than shame. The first Mad Pride event was held in 1999. It spread across the world. Shaughnessy died by suicide in December 2002. But the movement he helped create continues. Because the story does not end with reform. Even modern Bethlem, with its green spaces, its research partnerships, its evidence-based care, exists within a system that still struggles with fundamental questions. When is involuntary treatment justified? How do we balance safety with liberty? Who decides what constitutes mental illness? How do we ensure that treatment does not become coercion? In 2014, a 15-year-old named Chris Brennan died of asphyxiation at Bethlem Hospital after repeated self-harming. A coroner found that lack of proper risk assessment and lack of a care plan contributed to his death. The hospital cited staffing problems and low morale as factors. Lessons were learned, they said. The adolescent unit was assessed as good in 2016. But Chris Brennan is still dead. In 2018, the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act 2018 received royal assent. Known as Senni's Law, it requires psychiatric hospitals to give more detailed information about how and when restraints are used. It is named after Olaseni Lewis, a young black man who died in 2010 after being restrained by police in a psychiatric unit. The law is a step forward, but it exists because restraint, physical force applied to control patients, is still happening. And community treatment orders, CTOs, psychiatric parole, as critics call them, now exist in the UK. They allow mental health services to require patients to take medication, attend appointments, live in specific places, avoid certain behaviours, or be recalled to hospital involuntarily. Pete Shaughnessy and the Reclaim Bedlam campaign fought against CTOs in the 1990s. They were implemented anyway. These are not the abuses of the 18th century. They are not chains and iron harnesses. They are not rotational therapy or bloodletting. But they are still exercises of power, still systems of control, still mechanisms by which society manages those whose minds do not conform. And they raise uncomfortable questions. How much have we really changed? Bedlam. The word has outlived the hospital's reputation. When someone says, "It was Bedlam in there," they are not thinking of Bethlem Royal Hospital in Beckenham, with its orchard and occupational therapy garden. They are thinking of chaos, noise, disorder, things falling apart. The word has become a metaphor, detached from its origin, but still carrying its weight. In literature, film, and television, Bedlam continues to appear. 1946. The film Bedlam, starring Boris Karloff, depicts the hospital as a gothic nightmare of cruelty and madness. 2011 to 2012. The British TV series Bedlam uses the name for a supernatural horror show set in a former asylum. Countless books, poems, plays, and songs invoke Bedlam as shorthand for madness, suffering, and the loss of reason. The hospital's dark history has become cultural mythology. And perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing. Because myths serve a purpose. They remind us. They warn us. They keep us accountable. So what have we learned from the history of Bedlam? We have learned that mental illness is not caused by demonic possession or imbalances of humours. We understand neurotransmitters, brain chemistry, trauma, genetics, environmental factors. We have learned that brutal physical treatments, spinning, bleeding, cold baths, starvation, do not cure mental illness. We have developed medications that can genuinely help. Antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, anti-anxiety drugs. We have learned that confinement alone is not treatment. We prioritize community care, outpatient services, supported housing, crisis intervention. We have learned that people with mental illness are not curiosities or freaks. They are people with rights, with dignity, with humanity. But what have we not learned? We have not learned how to fully destigmatize mental illness. People still hide their diagnoses, still fear discrimination, still worry about being seen as crazy. We have not learned how to provide adequate funding for mental health services. Waiting lists are long. Resources are stretched. Many people cannot access the care they need. We have not learned how to eliminate coercion from psychiatric care. Involuntary commitment still exists. Forced medication still exists. Restraint still exists. We have not learned how to fully listen to the voices of patients and survivors. Decisions are still often made about them, not with them. And perhaps most fundamentally, we have not learned how to see suffering without the urge to control it. We have replaced chains with chemical restraints. We have replaced public spectacle with institutional opacity. We have replaced moral judgments with medical diagnoses. But the impulse remains. When someone's mind does not conform to our expectations, when they hear voices, see things that aren't there, feel emotions too intensely or not at all, when they cannot function in the ways society demands, we still want to manage them, to fix them, to make them fit. Is that wrong? That is the uncomfortable question. Because sometimes intervention is necessary. Sometimes people are a danger to themselves or others. Sometimes medication does help. Sometimes structure and support are exactly what is needed. The line between care and coercion is not always clear. The line between healing and control is not always bright. And therein lies the eternal dilemma. So why tell this story? Why spend 90 minutes walking through the dark history of Bedlam? Why linger on the suffering of James Norris, the cruelty of the Monros, the spectacle of the galleries? Because forgetting is dangerous. When we forget what was done, when we sanitize history, when we tell ourselves that could never happen now, we become vulnerable to repeating it. Perhaps not in the same forms, perhaps not with the same methods, but with the same underlying impulses. The impulse to other those who are different. The impulse to profit from suffering. The impulse to control what we do not understand. History is not a story about bad people doing bad things in the past. It is a story about systems, about how good intentions can produce horrific outcomes, about how authority, left unchecked, becomes abuse, about how easily suffering becomes normalized when it happens behind closed doors. The Monros were not monsters. They were educated, cultured men. Thomas Monro taught J. M. W. Turner to paint. John Monro collected books and prints. James Monro was a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. They believed they were helping people. They believed their treatments were medicine, not torture. And that is precisely what makes their story so chilling. Because it means that any of us could become complicit in cruelty if we are not vigilant, if we do not question authority, if we do not listen to those who are suffering, if we do not ask constantly, is this helping or is this harm? Throughout this story, we have focused on institutions, physicians, reformers, systems. But at the center, always at the center, are the patients. The 6 men recorded in 1403, mente capti, taken in their minds. The woman in the 18th century gallery, hunched in the corner, rocking back and forth while visitors threw stones. The man who believed he was king, performing for crowds who mocked him. Nathaniel Lee, the playwright, confined and observed like an animal in a zoo. James Norris, encased in iron for 12 years, lucid and articulate and completely powerless. The 20,000 bodies in mass graves on the hospital grounds. Chris Brennan, dead at 15 in 2014. These are not statistics. They are people. People who were born, who had families, friends, dreams, who experienced joy before they experienced illness, who deserved compassion and received cruelty, who deserved care and received confinement, who deserved dignity and received spectacle. When we tell the story of Bedlam, we are telling their story. And we owe it to them to tell it honestly, not to erase the horror. not to pretend it wasn't that bad, not to rush to the happy ending, because for many of them, there was no happy ending. If you visit Bethlem Royal Hospital today, you will find something entirely different from what we have described. You will find green spaces and gardens. You will find an adolescent unit where teenagers receive evidence-based treatment for eating disorders, psychosis, and severe anxiety. You will find a national psychosis unit conducting cutting-edge research. You will find occupational therapists helping patients tend an orchard, grow vegetables, create art. You will find a museum that does not shy away from the hospital's dark history, that displays those original Sibba statues, raving and melancholy madness as artifacts of a bygone era. You will find a park run every Saturday morning, where staff and patients and community members run together through the Bluebell Woods. And if you look carefully, if you know the history, you might feel the weight of it. 778 years. From a priory collecting alms for the Crusades to a modern NHS psychiatric hospital. From 6 men in 1403 to thousands of patients receiving care today. From chains and iron harnesses to therapy and medication. From public spectacle to private dignity. This brings our long history of the Bedlam Asylum to a close. If you'd like to continue these calm journeys through forgotten places and lives, you may like the video and subscribe for more quiet histories. For now, let the past settle and enjoy the rest of your night.